This episode is called Two Hearts Beat as One. On a sunny spring afternoon in 2016, 67-year-old Denise Powell threw open a window to let some fresh air into her home in British Columbia. Denise and her 66-year-old husband, Robert, had spent most of the day harvesting baby vegetables and spring flowers from their garden. Now, with a vase of fresh flowers on their table, they were sitting down to enjoy a healthy salad for lunch. A few years earlier, Denise had been diagnosed with high blood pressure and high cholesterol, which is having fat inside of your bloodstream. For the moment, she wasn't on any prescription medication, but her doctor had recommended a heart-healthy diet, emphasizing unprocessed food. And so ever since then, Denise had tried to do that, doing her best to eat as many fresh fruits and vegetables as she could. As Robert cracked a little salt and pepper over their bowls, Denise added a splash of red wine to each of their glasses. Then, after making a toast to celebrate their unusually warm spring, the two of them dug into their delicious lunch. Denise was born in China, and so she combined Western medicine with traditional Eastern practices to try to keep herself healthy. After lunch, she took her usual supplements of vitamin B12 along with traditional Chinese herbs. 20 minutes later, she put on some sunscreen, grabbed a hat, and headed out for her daily walk. But when she got back home, Denise felt more tired than usual. So she laid down to take a quick nap on the couch, thinking maybe she'd spent too much time in the sun. However, Denise slept right through her alarm and woke up hours later. And also, she woke up with this terrible pain gripping her stomach. Then these waves of nausea rolled through her body, and she stumbled from the couch to the nearest bathroom just in time to vomit. When she looked up, she saw Robert looking very concerned standing in the doorway. She would cling to him over the next few hours as he helped her go back and forth from the bathroom to the bed. And then eventually, she just stopped going back to the couch and just laid down in the bathroom. And as she laid in the bathroom, she noticed that it was not just nausea she was feeling, also her chest felt really tight. At this point, Robert asked Denise if she wanted to go to the hospital. But she said no, she didn't, at least not yet. So Robert began to wonder aloud if maybe this was just a bad case of food poisoning. But Denise shook her head and said they had both eaten the same thing that day and Robert was fine. She figured what was going on here was just a stomach bug, and she'd likely feel better after some sleep. So she had Robert help her up, and she crawled into bed, hoping that in the morning she would feel better. 3 days later, Denise lay curled up on the couch, still feeling pretty dizzy and nauseated. She looked at her watch right as Robert came in from his daily bike ride. She saw that a whole hour had passed since her last episode of vomiting, and so maybe she was on the mend. Robert walked over and handed her a few of her favorite roses, which he had just picked from their garden. Denise took the flowers with a smile and held them to her nose. But even the flowers' mild fragrance suddenly made her feel nauseous. And so Denise quickly handed the flowers back to Robert and got up and hobbled over to the bathroom. After emptying her stomach yet again, Denise collapsed back on the sofa. Robert had turned on their favorite show, but Denise barely had enough energy to focus on the TV. In fact, she found herself squinting against the brightness of the screen. And then, as she was squinting, she sat up and peered right at the television more closely. Something was very odd. Rings of bright yellow light circled the screen. She blinked and blinked, but these lights didn't go away. In fact, soon, the yellow lights surrounded everything she focused on. Her hand, a doorknob, a picture over the fireplace, these rings were all around them. She asked Robert sort of desperately, like, "Hey, do you see yellow rings around everything?" But he looked at her and he just said, "No, I don't." At this point, Denise wasn't sure what scared her more. The very concerned look on Robert's face as she was asking him this question, or the bright yellow halo that surrounded his head. Denise couldn't deny it anymore. She had to go to the hospital right now. Two hours later, inside the emergency room of the local hospital, Dr. Carmen Oliver wrapped 2 fingers around Denise's arm. She could barely feel the woman's pulse, which registered at only 53 beats per minute, very slow. Dr. Oliver could see that her new patient was totally exhausted and dehydrated from days of vomiting. But even more concerning was that Denise was reporting tightness in her chest. These issues, combined with her age, convinced Dr. Oliver that she was looking at more than just a run-of-the-mill case of the flu. Denise and her husband began to rattle off Denise's medical history. Dr. Oliver learned that Denise had a history of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, an inner ear disorder called Meniere's disease, and asthma. Dr. Oliver was not that surprised when Denise asked her if, what she had just experienced was maybe a heart attack, given her high risk factors for heart disease. That was actually Dr. Oliver's concern too, that this was a heart attack. So she ordered blood work, a chest x-ray, and an electrocardiogram, which is a test that shows a graph of how your heart is beating. Then she had Denise placed in a cubicle within steps of the nurse's station, just in case something happened. A little while later, after all the testing was done, Dr. Oliver met with Denise to go over her results. Dr. Oliver shared that Denise's blood work and chest x-ray were normal, which seemed to rule out a heart attack along with an infection or a stroke. However, Dr. Oliver said they were not out of the woods yet. She turned her data screen around to actually show Denise and Robert the full results of the ECG, and it was clear by their very worried expressions that they knew what they were looking at. Robert immediately pointed to a flat line between the two peaks of the heartbeat spike on Denise's graph. He knew the space between the peaks was supposed to be consistent, but here, the spaces were variable. Dr. Oliver nodded, confirming that the graph showed a 1 to 2 second delay between Denise's heartbeats. That irregular heart rhythm was dangerous. It meant she was susceptible to a heart attack or stroke at any moment. Just then, Dr. Oliver's pager beeped and a nurse appeared at the doorway. One of the doctor's other patients needed their attention right now. But before she moved down the hall to this next emergency, Dr. Oliver told Denise that she wouldn't be sending her home until they found out what was wrong with her heart. She assured her the cardiology team was already reviewing her case. A few hours later, Denise woke up from a nap, and for a moment, she had no idea where she was. Everywhere she looked, she just saw these swirling yellow halos and flashing lights. But the IV lines in her arms, the pads on her chest, and the monitors beeping around her bed reminded her she was still inside of the hospital. At the foot of her bed, she saw Robert speaking in hushed tones with a man she didn't recognize. Judging by the man's white coat and the concerned look on his face, Denise decided this must be her new doctor. When Robert noticed Denise was awake and he looked at her, she saw he also looked very concerned. At this point, the man in the white coat introduced himself. He said he was Dr. Arthur Hammond, and he was the head of cardiology at the hospital. Denise asked him if that should make her feel better or worse, that he, was here to talk to her about her case. And he jokingly admitted that he wasn't sure. He told her that he knew what was going wrong with her heart, but he didn't know why. He told Denise that what she was experiencing was something called a total heart block. Denise looked over at Robert, and she could tell he was just as confused as she was. Even with all her previous heart issues, they'd never heard of anything like this before. Dr. Hammond explained that a heart block was when the natural pacemaker in the heart stopped working correctly. In Denise's case, the little group of cells that sent electrical signals to regulate the rhythm of the heart weren't sending the messages fast enough, or at all, which created a high risk that blood flow to her heart would just stop, the true definition of a heart attack. And the way her heart appeared to be beating, it could happen at any moment. After that, Dr. Hammond very gently told her that she was going to be admitted to the cardiac intensive care unit, where she could be closely watched and undergo more testing. Denise felt Robert squeeze her hand, and then he stepped away as nurses moved around her bed, unhooking her from all the lines and monitors. As they began to roll her out of the room, Denise lay there in stunned silence, and everywhere she looked, all she saw were bright yellow halos. Three days later, Dr. Hammond gave a soft knock at the entrance to Denise's ICU cubicle, and as he entered, he immediately noticed that Denise was alone. Every other time he had made his rounds, Robert had been by her side. Denise remarked she actually hadn't heard from Robert all morning, to which Dr. Hammond smiled and told her he was glad Robert was getting some much-needed rest. Over the last few days, Dr. Hammond had run advanced heart function tests on Denise, and now he wanted to go over the results with her. he pulled the data screen close to her bedside and clicked on an animated version of her echocardiogram, which is different than the electrocardiogram she'd had previously. Echocardiogram is a test that uses sound waves to create an image of the heart as it pumps. The screen filled with various angles of the inside of her heart beating and pumping blood. Dr. Hammond pointed out all the structures and clicked on the animation loop over and over. Then, Dr. Hammond switched the screen to show Denise a video of her angiogram, which is a medical imaging test that uses X-rays along with a special dye to visualize blood vessels and their function. And so as they watched this video, it showed the dark dye progressing through her veins. The good news, he said, was that all these tests showed that there weren't any severe blockages or problems with the structure of her heart. But then he paused and said, unfortunately, there was some bad news too. He told Denise it was clear she was still very sick. There was nothing wrong with her heart structurally, but it was operating too slowly and not at the correct rhythm. And so she was still very much in danger of having a serious heart episode. Dr. Hammond could see Denise's face fall, but he assured her that all was not lost. There were some very good options for her care, and he wanted to go over them with her. At this point, it didn't surprise him when Denise said she actually wanted her husband to be a part of this conversation. So the doctor nodded and gave her some room while she picked up her phone to call Robert. At the same time, Dr. Hammond's pager beeped, calling him back to the emergency room. He promised Denise he'd be back as soon as he could. He left the room as Denise began leaving a voicemail for her husband. As Dr. Hammond walked into the busy ER, a nurse handed him a chart for a new cardiac patient. She pointed over to the older man who was laying on his side on the gurney facing away from them. Dr. Hammond glanced at the monitors and saw the man's heartbeat was extremely low. Also, as Dr. Hammond read the electrocardiogram, it showed strange patterns in the electrical signals of the man's heart. Dr. Hammond paused for a moment, shocked that this patient was basically showing the exact same symptoms that Denise had. And then, when Dr. Hammond took a look at the name on the patient's chart, his jaw dropped. The new patient was Denise's husband, Robert. Dr. Hammond immediately ordered Robert an IV drip just to be on the safe side, and then also began reviewing the notes from the ambulance drivers who had brought him in. And what he read shocked him. In addition to the nausea and chest pain, Robert had told the EMTs he was seeing yellow and red halos everywhere. Dr. Hammond remembered Denise talking about all these bright yellow halos everywhere when he first took her case, but he had no idea what to make of that. And so the mystery was only deepening here. Dr. Hammond now had two patients suffering from basically the exact same combination of symptoms, which was of course very rare. And so as a result of that, he knew that the odds were that whatever was wrong with Robert and Denise probably had very little to do with heart disease, because they didn't share the same heart here. Like, what were the odds that they both had the exact same heart disease and they both developed these symptoms identically at the same time? Like, that's not going to happen. But regardless of how this came to be, both of their hearts were in peril here. Either one of them could still suffer a heart attack at any moment, so there was no time to lose. Later that night, Dr. Hammond was back at the nurses' station of the cardiac ICU. He could see both Denise and Robert, who were now resting comfortably in beds right next to each other. Robert was reading, and Denise chatted quietly on her cell phone. Dr. Hammond pulled up both of their health histories to look them over side by side. Their records showed that they both had some level of cardiac disease that was typical for people their age. But high blood pressure and high cholesterol didn't explain what was happening to them now. And so this only added to his suspicion that their heart troubles were simply a symptom of a very different, larger problem. And so he started making a list of questions about their lifestyle and their environment that he intended to ask them both in the morning. But then as he was doing that, suddenly alarms began to sound from Denise's cubicle. And so he ran to Denise's bed with nurses right behind him, and he took one look at the monitors, and he could see that Denise's heart had gone into a deadly rhythm called ventricular tachycardia. The lower chamber of her heart was beating too fast to pump blood correctly. He could see Denise's eyes fluttering as she slid out of consciousness. Dr. Hammond knew he would have to act fast. If Denise's heart kept going like this for more than maybe 30 seconds, it could become starved of oxygen and just stop. Denise already had defibrillator pads applied to her chest for this kind of emergency. A defibrillator is a device that delivers a controlled electrical pulse that can shock the heart back into the correct rhythm. Years of experience kicked in, and Dr. Hammond stepped calmly to the control button of the device. He had to watch the electrocardiogram graph for the exact moment to deliver the electrical pulse. If he fired the defibrillator at the wrong time, he could actually put her heart into another cycle of the wrong rhythm. But just as suddenly as this episode began, it was over. Denise's eyes opened wide, and she started to breathe normally again. The monitor showed her heart had shifted back into the correct rhythm, apparently on its own. The doctor could see Denise clearly felt uncomfortable, but for now, she was out of danger. However, without knowing what had caused this episode, Dr. Hammond feared it could happen again at any moment. He left Denise's side as the staff took over to watch her recovery, and he went over to Robert. He knew Robert, for a host of reasons, would be petrified, not only because it was his wife, but also he had the same issues his wife did, so that could happen to him too. Dr. Hammond reassured Robert that Denise was fine for now, but the last episode was a sign that things were still very dangerous and unstable. As tears began to roll down Robert's face, Dr. Hammond handed him a cup of water and began speaking to him in very calming tones as he kept one eye on the blood pressure monitor. He didn't want Robert's anxiety to trigger any changes in his own heart rhythm. Now, ordinarily, Dr. Hammond would have put off asking Robert a whole bunch of questions at a time like this. But with Denise in such a dire situation, he knew there was no time to waste here. Once Robert's blood pressure appeared steady, Dr. Hammond stood behind the workstation screen and began taking notes. He gently guided Robert into a conversation about the day his wife first got sick. Dr. Hammond was hoping that maybe Robert might have a fresh detail or another memory, anything that could point to what happened that day that caused all this. But Robert told the same story Dr. Hammond had already heard about the sunny day a week ago where the couple worked in the garden and ate the salad of freshly picked vegetables. He heard how Denise got sick a couple hours later, and 3 days after that, she was in the hospital. But then, Dr. Hammond asked Robert to describe how he had gotten sick. Robert said he had felt fine until yesterday. He had gotten up and taken an early bike ride, and then picked some kale from their garden and made an omelet with the fresh vegetables. And then a few hours later, he felt so ill he could barely drive himself to the emergency room. Dr. Hammond's ears perked up the moment Robert mentioned adding the plants from their garden into his breakfast. He asked if the vegetables Robert ate were the same ones that he and his wife had eaten together a week earlier when Denise had gotten sick, and Robert said yes. And so now, the whole thing had Dr. Hammond totally confused. He wondered how two people could eat the same thing at the same time, but get sick a week apart. Dr. Hammond thanked Robert and began to leave the room, but then Robert called him back over to say he actually remembered one more thing. He told him that the greens he ate that morning, right before he got sick, were definitely a little bitter. Robert also recalled that on the day Denise got sick, she had said her salad had tasted very bitter as well, but he, a week ago, had not noticed that in his own salad. At this, Dr. Hammond knew he finally had something that stood out. He told Robert he would need to run some new blood tests, but hopefully, those tests would get them the answers they needed. Early the next morning, Dr. Hammond was in his office when his inbox pinged. The results of Robert and Denise's new blood tests were in, and they were shocking. Both blood samples contained high levels of a cardiac medication known as digoxin. Dr. Hammond couldn't believe that both Denise and Robert could forget something this important, and so he wondered if maybe there was some piece of their medical history that had slipped through the cracks. Dr. Hammond walked into Denise's room and he asked her about taking digoxin. But Denise told him, no, she's not taking that and had never even heard of it. The doctor even showed her pictures of what the medication looked like, but Denise swore she was not taking it and never had. After that, the doctor crossed the hallway into Robert's room, but he would get the same blank look and firm no from Robert about digoxin. Apparently, neither of them were taking it. But Dr. Hammond felt like this couldn't be a mistake. I mean, the digoxin chemicals were clearly in their blood. They'd gotten there somehow. At this point, the doctor began to think, how else could the digoxin get into their bloodstream? And that's when he had an idea. He mentioned this idea to Denise, who immediately picked up her phone and called her sister. A few hours later, Denise's sister arrived, and she handed Dr. Hammond a basket of fresh produce from Denise and Richard's garden. The doctor put on a pair of gloves and began sifting through the carrots and tomatoes until he came across the kale, because Robert had told him that before Denise got sick, she had claimed the kale was bitter, even though Robert had tasted the kale and it wasn't bitter to him. But then a week later, when Robert said the kale tasted bitter, he got sick. And as Dr. Hammond stared at this kale, he realized what was wrong. Denise and Robert had been poisoned. It would turn out Denise and Robert's garden was full of vegetables, fruits, and flowers that were all in early stages of growth. Some of the kale leaves that the doctor were looking at were in fact kale, but mixed in with the kale were leaves of a different plant called foxglove. As young plants, kale and foxglove look very similar. While kale is perfectly safe and healthy to eat, foxglove is not. In fact, it is highly toxic. Foxglove contains digitalis, a compound used in heart medications like digoxin. In precise doses, digoxin can help regulate heart rhythm, but too much can be fatal. It can also lead to visual hallucinations like the ones that Denise and Robert had experienced, where they saw all those bright-colored halos around everything. It's not exactly clear why Denise got so sick so quickly on the same day that she and Robert both ate the same type of salad. It's possible that Denise got most of the bitter foxglove leaves on her plate, and Robert ate mostly kale. Or maybe Robert simply ate fewer of the poisonous leaves, or he ate smaller ones, which had less of the chemical. Whatever the reason, on the day Robert did finally get sick, he just must have eaten more of the foxglove leaves instead of the kale. Ultimately, both Robert and Denise had eaten enough of this foxglove to put them both on the brink of death. As soon as Dr. Hammond realized what was going on, he immediately gave Denise and Robert the antidote for digoxin poisoning, a medication called digoxin Fab. And within an hour, they were both feeling remarkably better. Denise and Robert were both well enough to go home within days, and as soon as they got home, they made sure to remove every foxglove plant from their garden, and also the kale, just to be safe. Around noon on January 13th, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses was sitting in her office at the University of Texas at Dallas when she heard her cell phone ding inside of her purse. Anna knew she was not supposed to use her cell phone during work, but she had a feeling she'd just gotten a text from someone very special. So Anna kind of discreetly slid her phone out of her purse, and when she looked at the screen, she smiled. Like she'd thought, her boyfriend, Michael Stodnick, had texted her to confirm that they were still on for dinner that night. Just looking at this message gave Anna butterflies. Michael was a business professor at the university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had seriously dated since her divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been an item now for the last 6 months, but for Anna, who'd previously been married for 15 years, dating still felt very new. She and Michael were both single parents in their early 40s, but this new relationship made Anna feel young again. Anna quickly texted Michael to let him know she was definitely still on for dinner, then she quietly slid her phone back into her purse and got back to work. Anna was the assistant director of strategic planning and analysis at UT Dallas, but that was not her only job. She was also a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in data analytics, so Anna was very busy. But as soon as the clock hit 2 p.m., Anna stood up from her desk and headed upstairs. She knocked on an office door before opening it, but really the knocking was just a formality. The person sitting at the desk inside, University Vice Provost John Workowski, always expected Anna for afternoon tea. When Anna walked in, the 71-year-old administrator greeted her with a smile and called her by a special nickname, Babochka. It meant butterfly in Russian, and hearing it made Anna feel nostalgic for the country where she grew up. Anna sat down across from Dr. Workowski, and right away he handed her a steaming cup of tea. Dr. Workowski had wild gray hair, big glasses, and he always smelled like cigarettes. Anna was not particularly fond of the smell in his office, but she still felt very comfortable with him because over the past 2 years, she'd spent hours in this office confiding to him about her personal life. Dr. Wachowski knew things about Anna that most people simply didn't, like that she'd immigrated to the United States in 1998 just to marry her now ex-husband, Bob Moses. He and Anna had met in Russia when Bob was visiting as a tourist. Then they kept in touch through email for months until he finally asked her to marry him. Bob had been Anna's anchor in America, which made their divorce that much more painful for her. Anna and her ex, Bob, were still on very friendly terms, but at this point, Dr. Wachowski had really taken over the role of being Anna's rock now. That day, Anna and Dr. Wachowski's conversation centered around Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was a student right there at UT Dallas. Anna said she was worried that she and her son might be growing apart. The previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his dorm to her home in Frisco, Texas, as he usually did, but Igor had seemed quiet and distant all weekend. It made Anna worry that he had some problem that he didn't want to talk about. Dr. Wachowski sipped his tea, then told Anna she was a great mother and not to worry. Sometimes children, especially adult children, just need some space. He assured her that whatever was going on with him, Igor would eventually tell her when he was ready. Anna sighed and said, you're probably right. Then she finished her tea, gave the doctor a hug, and headed back downstairs to her office. A couple hours later, at around 5 p.m., Anna turned off her computer and grabbed her purse. It was cold outside, in the 30s, so near freezing, so Anna put on her coat and 2 scarves before waving goodbye to her coworkers and walking outside to the parking garage. She got inside of her blue Hyundai sedan and then headed into rush hour traffic. Part of the way home, Anna's stomach began to growl. She was hungry. Anna looked at the clock and saw that it was 5:30, which meant her boyfriend Michael would not be picking her up for dinner for another 2 hours. So she decided to pull off the highway right then and go to a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell that served Mexican food, and she went through the drive-thru and she bought a chicken quesadilla. Anna was really hungry, but after receiving the food, she didn't eat it in the car. Instead, she just set it on her passenger seat. Anna generally preferred to keep her surroundings really tidy, and so she never ate in her car. It was just too messy. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned into her neighborhood. As she approached her 2-story brick house, she stopped beside her mailbox and rolled the window down to grab her mail. Then she pulled her Hyundai into the garage. Anna shut the garage door behind her, she gathered up her purse, her mail, and her quesadilla, and she got out of the car. She walked towards the door that led into her home, thinking about how excited she was for her date that night with Michael. But as she reached for the doorknob, Anna heard the sound of rustling behind her, followed by a loud clap. Just after 7:30 p.m. on the same day, Michael pulled up to Anna's house, and he noticed all the lights were off, as if Anna was not home. Michael was confused, but he got out of his car and knocked on Anna's front door. When she didn't answer, he called her, but she didn't pick up. Michael thought about going inside. Anna had actually recently given him a house key, but he knew Anna always turned on her alarm system when she left the house, and he didn't know the code to disable it, and he didn't want to set it off and cause a scene in such a quiet neighborhood. Michael began to feel cold just standing outside, so he turned around, went back to his car, and tried calling Anna again. But Anna's phone again went to voicemail. Anna had never missed a date with Michael before, but Michael told himself, Anna was very busy, she was a grad student and a mother, she could have easily gotten sidetracked with any number of things. So even though he was very disappointed, Michael decided to go home and wait for Anna to call him back. He was sure she would explain everything as soon as she could. The next morning at 9 a.m., Michael once again pulled into Anna's driveway. He had continued calling and texting her until 11 p.m. the previous night, but she never responded. Michael even contacted Anna's friends to ask about her, but they too had not heard from her. And so when Michael woke up on this morning with no text or no calls from Anna, the first thing he did was drive to her house. Michael knocked on the front door, and when there was no response, instead of going in, he instead called the Frisco Police Department. He told the dispatcher that he hadn't heard from his girlfriend since the previous afternoon when she was working at UT Dallas, and now he was at her house knocking on her door and she wasn't answering phone calls or text messages, and so he asked if somebody could come out to her house to make sure she was okay. The dispatcher was obviously empathetic, but they told Michael that for this type of thing, protocol was he would need to call the university's campus police first, and then if for some reason they couldn't handle it, then they would ratchet this up to the Frisco Police Department. And so Michael hung up and then looked up the number for the university campus police and called them, and they promised him they would look into the situation right away. Michael thanked them and hung up, and even though he still felt very uneasy about this, he had to get to work. So he got into his car and drove away. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Ream received a call from the University of Texas Dallas campus police. They told Sergeant Ream they were looking for a university employee named Anna Moses. Her boyfriend had just called to request a welfare check, and the campus police had quickly learned that Anna did not show up for work that day, which her coworkers said was highly unusual. Because Anna was not actually living on campus, the university officer asked Ream if he could go check her home in Frisco. Ream said he was on it, and a few minutes later he was out the door, headed towards Anna's address. Ream got there at 10:50 a.m. and knocked on the door. When nobody answered, Sergeant Ream tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Ream knew he could knock down Anna's door, but that seemed extreme. Instead, he called the campus police back and asked if they knew anyone who could let him inside. Over an hour later, at 12:05 p.m., 2 cars pulled up outside of Anna's house. A campus police officer stepped out of one, and Anna's son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had been able to find Igor on campus, and he told them he had a key and knew the alarm code to his mother's house. Igor nodded curtly at Sergeant Ream, then unlocked his mother's front door and walked inside and disabled the alarm. As Ream entered Anna's home, Igor walked past him and back outside. He did not seem concerned at all about his mother. He just said he'd be out in the car waiting for whenever they were done. Sergeant Ream thought Igor's behavior was strange, but he couldn't worry about that right now. Instead, he and the university police officer walked into Anna's foyer. The house was totally silent except for the officer's footsteps on the tile. They searched the first floor, but they didn't find any sign of Anna, and they were about to head upstairs when the sergeant remembered they should scope out the garage. Ream made his way to the door that led to the garage, and he opened it. And right away, even in the darkness, he could tell Anna's car was not parked inside, making the garage feel very empty. Then he flipped on the overhead light, and he gasped. Anna was lying on her back on the garage floor with blood coming out of her mouth, and there were bullet casings all around her. It was obvious just from looking at her that she was deceased. The university officer came over and looked into the garage too, and instantly brought a hand up to his mouth in shock. Neither of the officers had ever seen anything like this before. Frisco was an extremely safe community with very few violent crimes. It actually had been called one of the safest cities in the entire United States. But that only made Anna's apparent murder that much more shocking. Her quiet suburban home was now a crime scene. Even though he rarely worked homicide cases, Sergeant Ream knew the protocol. First, he and the university officer backed out of the garage and closed the door so they would not disturb any evidence. Then they checked the rest of Anna's home to make sure nobody else was there. Once they confirmed the house was empty, Ream called the Frisco Police Department for assistance. Ream then slowly walked outside towards Igor's car parked by the curb. As he got closer, Igor rolled down the window and looked at the sergeant without saying anything. Once he reached the car, Ream took a deep breath and told Igor that he had terrible news. His mother was dead, and it looked like she'd been murdered. The sergeant watched Igor for a reaction, but the young man's face was blank. Then Igor just furrowed his eyebrows and asked if his mother was in one piece. Sergeant Ream was so surprised by this question that he just said, "Well, yeah." Igor nodded and then said he had to go because he had class. Ream had no idea what to make of Igor's very bizarre reaction. It was so odd, but Igor had just received this life-shattering news, and Ream knew, shock can make people behave in totally inexplicable ways. So for now, Ream decided to give Igor a pass, and he just figured, they would do everything they could to find out what happened to his mother. Then the sergeant heard a siren blaring, and he looked up to see a Frisco PD cruiser heading his way. A few minutes later, Frisco detective Brian Schutte and Texas Ranger Reuben Mankin stood inside of Anna's garage. The two men were from different agencies, but they'd both been assigned to lead the case together. The crime scene made Schutte feel totally sick. He was a very young detective, and this wasn't just the first time he'd be leading a murder investigation. This was his first murder case that he'd ever worked on. Detective Schutte squatted next to Anna's body. She was still wearing a heavy coat and 2 scarves, but he could see a bullet wound in her neck. And scattered on the floor around her were a few unopened envelopes, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and a black purse. There were also a handful of bullet casings, which the detective identified as coming from a .22 caliber gun. Detective Schutte told Mencken that it seemed like Anna had been outside, which is why she was wearing warm clothes, and she had come in and was carrying her mail, purse, and fast food trash when somebody shot her in her garage. Schutte figured that Anna had likely been killed the previous evening when she came home from work. Ranger Mencken nodded in agreement, but he pointed out that Anna's car wasn't parked in the driveway or the garage, so he wondered if her killer had stolen it. Maybe Anna had been killed during a robbery. But then Detective Schutte opened up Anna's black purse, and it didn't seem like anybody had rifled through it. And Anna's wallet, which contained $300 in cash, was still inside her purse. And the inside of Anna's house also looked totally undisturbed. So if this was a robbery, the only thing the killer stole was Anna's car, which didn't really make any sense. Schutte told Mencken that he really wasn't sure about the robbery theory, it felt kind of weak, but the missing car did give them a good place to start. So Schutte radioed the Frisco Police Department and asked a fellow officer to put out a bulletin about Anna's stolen vehicle. But at the same time, Schutte was thinking to himself that it seemed most likely that Anna had been killed by somebody she knew. After all, the killer had clearly gained access to the garage without breaking in, and the young detective couldn't stop thinking about the very strange statements and behavior of Anna's son, which the local police had briefed him about. Schutte really wanted to interview Igor as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Detective Schutte sat down across from Igor inside of an interview room at the Frisco police station. Igor looked remarkably calm, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. The detective asked Igor to please talk about his relationship with his mother. Igor said that he and his mother had always been very close. They both loved music, and when Igor joined a Christian rock band as a teenager, his mom supported him and came to almost all of his shows. Even now that Igor was living on his own at college, he still went home to visit her every weekend. Anna kind of babied him by doing his laundry and cooking for him, but Igor kind of liked it. But he said seeing Anna divorce his dad had been really difficult. Bob actually was not Igor's biological father. He had adopted him. And so for Igor, he looked at Bob as his father. That was his dad. And when Igor said that, Schutte stopped him because he hadn't realized Bob was not his biological father. But Igor explained that his mother had actually been married twice, once briefly to a man in Russia and then to Bob in the United States. The Russian man was Igor's biological father, but Bob had legally adopted Igor when he was just 4 years old. And as Igor talked about his dad, Bob, he became emotional. Igor said he, personally, Igor, had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer when he was just 8 years old, and his dad had always been there to support him. Igor's cancer eventually went into remission, but the experience showed Igor that Bob genuinely loved him like he was his own son. Detective Schutte couldn't help but feel moved by Igor's story, but he wanted to stay focused on the horrible crime he was still investigating. So he asked Igor if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother. Igor thought for a moment and then said no. But he added, whoever killed his mother should be forgiven. Igor said he was a devout Christian and he believed all people, even killers, should be treated with mercy. Schutte was shocked. Igor did not seem to care at all that his mother was horribly murdered, but the detective just stared at the college student trying to remain professional and followed up by asking Igor where he'd been the previous evening. Igor said he had been in class from around 5:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., and he had classmates who could vouch for him. Schutte did not have any evidence that would allow him to hold Igor any longer, though he still felt very suspicious of him. But despite Schutte's inexperience as a detective, he still knew the worst thing an investigator could do right now was get tunnel vision about one suspect. For now, he knew he needed to explore every possibility, and he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to next. Anna's ex-husband and Igor's dad, Bob. After Schutte told Igor he was free to go, the detective went to his office, and he saw Ranger Mencken had left him a note about the progress in his investigation, and that the medical examiner had sent a copy of Anna's autopsy report over. Mencken's note explained that he'd been able to reconstruct Anna's last day by obtaining security camera footage from UT Dallas, local toll roads, a Taco Bell, and also an elementary school near Anna's house. After reviewing this footage, Mencken estimated that Anna got home from work between 5:50 and 5:55 p.m. on January 13th, and based on the crime scene, he felt certain she was killed almost immediately when she went inside. Next, Schutte looked over the autopsy report that was sent over, which largely supported Mencken's theory about when Anna was killed. The medical examiner said Anna had been shot at close range 6 times. All of the bullets came from the same .22 caliber gun, and the wounds were grouped tightly together, which made the medical examiner think her killer had some level of experience using firearms. But there was one odd detail that really stood out to the medical examiner. The detectives had told him before he did the autopsy that Anna had bought a quesadilla at around 5:30 p.m., which would be less than half an hour before she was killed. And considering they found the empty wrapper for this quesadilla next to her dead body, it suggested she had eaten it. However, when the medical examiner examined Anna's stomach contents, it looked like she hadn't eaten for many hours prior to her death. And if Anna didn't eat that quesadilla, well, according to the medical examiner, it seemed highly plausible that her killer did. Schutte was so disturbed by the idea of somebody who could shoot someone in cold blood 6 times, kill them right in their house, and then pick up their Taco Bell and eat it over their body. It just seems so unbelievably psychotic. And so Schutte called Ranger Mencken and said he knew it was late, but they did not have time to waste. They really needed to dig in right now. So, shortly before midnight on Wednesday, January 14th, Schutte and Mencken knocked on the door of a medium-sized home in Frisco. This is where Bob had been living since his and Anna's divorce. He was renting a room and sharing the home with 3 other men. Bob answered the door. He was wearing pajamas and looked confused to see the police. He asked if everything was okay, and Detective Schutte just said no. They needed to speak with him about his ex-wife, but it would be better if they talked at the police station. But Bob didn't move right away. Instead, he stayed in his doorway and just kept asking, really, what's happening here? Can you tell me anything else? And finally, Detective Schutte said, "I'm sorry, but unfortunately, your ex-wife is dead." As soon as he said it, Bob's face just fell, and he agreed to go with them to the station. Bob's interview began at 1 a.m., so it was now Thursday, January 15th. And it wasn't until Schutte, Mencken, and Bob were actually sitting in the interview room that they told Bob Anna was not just dead, she had been murdered. Bob looked horrified, and his first question was, "Is Igor okay?" The police assured Bob that Igor was fine. Then Ranger Mencken asked Bob where he'd been on the evening of January 13th, the night that Anna was killed. Bob said he'd been home watching TV till about 7 p.m., and then he went out for dinner, and he said his 3 housemates could easily confirm his story. Bob admitted he owned 5 guns, 3 of which were .22 caliber, and he agreed to hand them all over to police for ballistics analysis. And when detectives asked him for a DNA sample, he gave them a swab without any hesitation. Ranger Mencken thanked Bob for his cooperation and told him he was free to go. After Bob was gone, both Mencken and Schutte agreed that Bob did seem honest and seemed genuinely distressed at his ex-wife's death, but they still needed to follow up on his alibi. However, it was super late, nearly 2 a.m., and so Schutte and Mencken decided to call it a day. But just then, Schutte's phone rang. A Frisco Police Department patrol officer told him that they had just found Anna's stolen car in a residential neighborhood a few blocks away from her house, and the patrol officer was pretty sure they could see blood inside. Schutte's heart started to race. He told the patrol officer to make sure nobody touched that car. In the meantime, he would arrange for a tow truck to bring the vehicle to the crime lab for analysis. After a few hours of sleep, Schutte arrived at the Frisco Police Department crime lab early on Thursday morning. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was there, and a technician was waiting to brief the detective on what they'd found. The technician said the vehicle was remarkably clean inside, except for a few things. There was an empty Red Bull energy can, there was a cigarette butt, and there were 2 small bloodstains, one on the right side of the driver's seat and one on the center console. Schutte was really excited at this news. And so he had the can, cigarette, and swabs of the blood sent off for DNA testing, along with the swab that Bob had given them during his interview. But Schutte knew it could take weeks to get these results back, so for now, he still had to continue with old-fashioned detective work. The most obvious person to interview next was Anna's boyfriend, Michael. He agreed to come in for an interview, and soon Schutte was sitting across from the business professor at the police station. Michael leaned forward and ran his hands through his short brown hair. He looked anxious, and before Schutte even began the interview, Michael asked if he should have a lawyer. The detective promised him this was all totally routine. Michael picked at his fingernails as he told Schutte that he and Anna had not been dating for very long, but their relationship had been moving in a good direction. He said a few days ago, on January 13th, he'd gone to Anna's house to pick her up just after 7:30, and he'd been confused by her absence. And now he was horrified to know Anna had been lying dead in her garage the entire time he was there. Once Michael began talking, he started to open up a bit more, but as soon as Schutte asked him for a DNA sample, he clammed up. Then he asked again about maybe getting a lawyer. The detective said that really wasn't necessary, but he would give Michael some time alone to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. Schutte left, but what Michael didn't know was that the detective could still see and hear Michael through a camera in the corner of the room. So Schutte watched as Michael began mumbling to himself. The detective could not make out all the words, but at one point, Michael asked himself, "Am I overreacting?" A few minutes later, the detectives went back in and asked Michael if he had made a decision. Michael said yes. He said he would give a sample of his DNA. Schutte smiled, and then he got the swab from Michael and told him he was free to go. Then Schutte sent this newest DNA sample to be tested against the other items from Anna's car. While they waited for the DNA results, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mankin interviewed some of Anna's friends and co-workers. And quickly, the investigators soon learned that Bob and Michael were not the only men in Anna's life. Anna's friends pointed detectives towards a man named Jerry Caspel, a poet who they said had a deep spiritual bond with Anna. Her co-workers also mentioned a vice provost at UT Dallas named Dr. John Warkowski, who seemed to be Anna's mentor. Detective Schutte contacted Jerry first, and when he arrived for his interview, he was totally overwrought and on the brink of tears. He told the detective that Anna was his muse, and without her, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to write poetry again. Schutte narrowed his eyes at Jerry's very melodramatic display, but he let him keep talking. Jerry explained that he met Anna at a public speaking course a few years back, and they'd bonded over their love of art. They often went to the opera together, and Anna would read and edit Jerry's poems. He'd published 2 books of poetry and dedicated them both to her. Schutte thought this connection sounded very intense, so he asked Jerry what Anna's boyfriend thought about them being so close, and Jerry looked surprised. He said he didn't even know Anna had a boyfriend. But regardless, he insisted their relationship was not romantic, it was purely spiritual. The detective found the whole tale pretty hard to believe. He asked Jerry if he owned any firearms, and Jerry said yes, he had a .22 caliber handgun. But he quickly agreed to let the police analyze it, and he also gave them a DNA sample. Next, Schutte asked where Jerry was around 6 p.m. on January 13th. Jerry said he was driving home from work on a Dallas toll road that was very far away from Anna's home, and the toll records would certainly reflect that. Schutte thanked Jerry, and as soon as the poet left, Schutte just shook his head. It did not seem like Jerry was a viable suspect. So he called the next man on his list. A few days later, Detective Schutte began to interview Dr. John Warkowski. The university administrator explained that he met Anna through work, and they grew very close during her divorce. Then, Dr. Warkowski said something surprising. He told the detective that he and Anna once had an affair. Schutte stared at the man, who was 70 years old, making him 27 years older than Anna. Dr. Warkowski said he knew that he and Anna seemed like an unlikely pair, but it really was true. He said Anna wanted to have a relationship with him, and he had to cut it off because of their age difference. It just seemed totally inappropriate. But they still remained close friends, and so Dr. Warkowski knew very intimate details about her life, like how she struggled emotionally and financially after her divorce. Dr. Warkowski said he considered it his privilege to help Anna with money. In fact, in the 2 years since her divorce, he'd wired her a total of $46,000 US. Dr. Warkowski insisted this money was given as a gift with no strings attached, but Schutte was not convinced. He wondered if maybe, during one of their intimate conversations, Anna had learned something about the administrator that he wanted to keep hidden. What if those gifts were actually hush money payments? Or maybe he was paying Anna for sex, and she was threatening to expose him. Thinking about the items found in Anna's car, Schutte asked Dr. Warkowski if he drank energy drinks or smoked cigarettes. Dr. Warkowski said he didn't like energy drinks, but he definitely smoked. And when the detective asked for his whereabouts on the evening of January 13th, the administrator said the same thing Jerry did. He was driving home from work on a toll road that was far away from Anna's home, and certainly the records would reflect that. Schutte made a note of this, but unlike Jerry, he didn't think this let Dr. Warkowski off the hook. so Schutte asked the administrator if he'd be willing to give a voluntary DNA sample. Dr. Wachowski said he was happy to do anything that would help the police solve this case, so he let the detective swab the inside of his cheek before he left the police station. At this point, Detective Schutte felt like he had 5 strong suspects: Anna's son Igor, her ex-husband Bob, and her boyfriend Michael, plus the poet Jerry, and the university administrator Dr. John Wachowski. They all claimed to have alibis, however, none of them had been corroborated yet. Detective Schutte briefed Mencken on everything he discovered about these suspects, and Mencken agreed that they couldn't rule any of them out quite yet. Shortly after that, the detectives got disappointing news from the ballistics analysis on Bob and Jerry's guns. None of the guns matched the one that killed Anna, so they still didn't have the murder weapon. Schutte sighed. Until he got the DNA results and Mencken finished investigating their suspects' alibis, he had no other leads to pursue. But Detective Schutte didn't want to just sit around waiting for other investigators to do their work, so he started wondering if maybe he should go back to Anna's house and have another look around. Police had done an initial search, but there was always a chance something got missed. So Schutte obtained a search warrant, and in late January, about 2 weeks after Anna's murder, he returned to her home. When he got there, he saw there were 2 cars parked outside. So he went up to the door and knocked, and was surprised when Anna's ex-husband, Bob, answered the door. Igor was standing just a few feet behind him. It turned out the father and son had moved into Anna's home a couple weeks ago, 1 day after her body was found in the garage. This struck the detective as a very strange thing to do, but Bob quickly explained that he and his son were grieving together. And because Igor lived in a college dorm and Bob lived in a house with 3 other men, Anna's home was the only private place they could go to. Schutte said that did make sense. However, even though they wanted private time, he held up a search warrant and said he needed to come inside. So Bob immediately opened the door wide and said, "Come on in." The first thing Schutte did is he went into Anna's home office. There, he dug through her desk drawers until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a copy of Anna's life insurance policy. Anna had taken out a policy worth $750,000 US, and she had named one person as the sole beneficiary, her son, Igor. Suddenly, it looked like Igor, whose behavior had struck investigators as very odd from the onset, stood to gain a lot from his mother's death. Then Schutte managed to jimmy open a locked drawer in her desk, and he found something even more interesting. It was a handwritten letter, mostly in Russian. He couldn't understand what it said because he didn't speak Russian, but he figured it must contain something very private since Anna had kept it in a locked drawer. Schutte quietly slid the letter into an envelope and then left the desk and finished searching the rest of the house. He didn't find anything else in the house of note, and so after he left and got back to the police station, he sent a copy of that letter to the FBI so an agent who spoke Russian could translate it for him. In early February, Detective Schutte received a translation of that letter from Anna's desk, and suddenly, Anna's murder started to make a lot more sense. Anna had written this letter herself about one of the police's suspects, and it cast her connection to this man into a totally new light. Next, Ranger Mencken reported back that he had checked out all 5 men's alibis, and he'd been able to verify all of their stories except for one of them. The person whose alibi could not be confirmed was also the same person Anna had written about in her letter. And finally, Schutte got the results of the DNA analysis. DNA from the Red Bull can and cigarette butt in Anna's car did not match any of the suspects, and it didn't match anybody in their criminal database. But those bloodstains found in Anna's car did match a suspect, the same one who did not have an alibi and who Anna wrote about. And so, based on this evidence, along with further investigation into this primary suspect, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Moses when she returned home from work on January 13th, 2015. Late that afternoon, Anna's killer crouched in a corner of her garage, clutching a .22 caliber rifle. He'd been able to slip inside a few minutes earlier because he knew the code to open the garage. Now he was waiting for Anna to get home. Just past 5:50 p.m., the killer heard the sound of the automatic garage door sliding open. Light began to fill the dark garage, and so as it did, he pressed his body back against the wall, trying to be as small and out of sight as possible. He watched as Anna pulled her car inside. The garage door shut, and the killer heard Anna's car door open and then close. Then he listened to her footsteps as she walked towards the door to her house. But before she could open it, the killer stood, raised his gun, and fired 3 shots into her back. Anna spun around in shock. She dropped her mail, purse, and the quesadilla she'd been carrying but not eating. Before she could say anything, the killer fired 3 more shots. 2 hit Anna in the chest, and the other hit her in the neck. Anna crumpled to the ground with blood flowing out of her mouth. Anna's killer slowly lowered his rifle and walked towards her. He watched her chest for any sign of movement, but it wasn't moving. She was not breathing. So he picked up her car keys off the floor and was about to get into her car when he saw the uneaten chicken quesadilla on the floor. So he picked it up, ate it right next to her body, and left the wrapper behind. The killer then got into Anna's car, opened up the garage door again, backed out, and shut the door as he drove away. But he didn't realize that he had a cut on his right hand and it was leaking blood onto Anna's car seat and center console. The following evening, the killer abandoned the blue Hyundai in a neighborhood a few blocks away from Anna's home, and as law enforcement investigated Anna's murder, her killer did his best to appear very cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed, and he agreed to give a swab of his DNA. But at the same time the killer was kind of putting on this act, in the background, he was doing everything he could to profit off of Anna's death. And that's what police understood as soon as they read the translation of that Russian letter. It was a note that Anna had written to her lawyer in 2013 during her divorce from Bob, and she told her lawyer that Bob was now threatening to kill himself and frame Anna as his murderer just so her son, Igor, would hate her. When Detective Schutte read this, he realized Anna and Bob's divorce was not nearly as amicable as people thought. In fact, the couple had a long history of problems. In 2008, Anna visited a counselor after learning Bob had an affair. She wanted to leave him, but said she felt indebted to him because of how much he'd helped her during Igor's cancer battle. And years later, Anna had called one of her close friends crying, saying she had locked herself in a closet because she was afraid Bob was going to kill her. Anna hid these ugly realities about Bob from her son because she knew her son loved Bob. Bob was the only father figure Igor had ever known, and Anna didn't want to damage that relationship, even if it meant she had to act friendly towards a man she feared. But Bob was angry that Anna divorced him, and he was filled with jealousy over Anna's relationship with Michael. Adding to Bob's bitterness, Anna got total ownership of the large 2-story house they used to share. Bob claimed that at the time Anna was killed, he was at home watching TV, but his housemates told police they did not remember him being home at that time. And while none of Bob's guns matched the murder weapon, he was a military veteran with experience using guns. And so police believe Bob must have taken apart the murder weapon and hid or destroyed the pieces. And if police had any doubts that Bob was the killer, well, the DNA evidence totally erased those doubts. It was clearly Bob's blood inside of Anna's car, likely from a cut on Bob's right hand that he had bandaged by the time he met with police. On February 26, 2015, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mankin arrested Bob at Anna's home. Bob maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty at his trial. Bob's defense argued that there were too many unanswered questions in Anna's murder, like whose DNA was on the Red Bull can and the cigarette butt found in Anna's car. But the prosecution argued that Bob may have planted this evidence just to confuse investigators. In the end, a jury found Bob guilty of murder, and a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Bob would appeal his conviction in 2018, but an appeals court upheld the jury's original ruling, and to this day, Bob remains incarcerated.
You call my name when the night feels wrong. I play the part, but I don't belong. You leave her but not too far, and I wait here beneath your scars. Your touch feels real, but your heart's away. It beats for her, though you let it stray. I'm holding a borrowed heart.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for